and welcome to another interview with me, Thomas Taplin. In the studio today, I'm joined by Dr. Christian Koch, who is the International Relations Director of the Gulf Research Centre here in Geneva. Dr. Christian Koch, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
Christian, if I can call you that.
Yeah, sure.
Last time you were in the studio, we were speaking predominantly about the relationship between the West and the Middle East, specifically Iran, on Iran's nuclear capabilities, its ambitions and so on. Now, today, even though Iran could factor into this, I want to focus on energy and specifically oil and gas and the relationship at the moment between the West and oil-rich countries such as Libya, for instance, and Iran, but specifically shale gas and oil and fracking. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'd like to focus on today, because I believe the relationship here is also interesting to explore. What's the most up-to-date report that you can give me where the Middle East supplies the West right now? What's the latest information that you have?
Well, I mean, it's not an issue anymore of the Middle East necessarily supplying the West. Already the West is getting a lot of its energy from different sources. The Middle Eastern energy, oil and gas, is mainly going to Asia. Asia is the growth engine of the world right now. Japan gets 90% of its energy needs from the Gulf states. China is near 50% and quickly rising. India is 70% and also rising. Already most of the oil exports from the Middle Eastern that travels through the Strait of Hormuz are going to Asian countries. The US is importing less and less oil from the Middle East, from a country like Saudi Arabia, than ever before. Western Europe, it's getting most of its oil either from Northern Africa or from the North Sea or from Russia. So the dependence here on the Middle East has already lessened quite a degree, and Asia is the important region of the world.
Okay. So where does shale oil and gas enter this, and what are the long-term ramifications to the relationship, the slightly uneven relationship between the West, with countries like the US and obviously Europe, and countries in the Middle East?
I think the dimension that's important to look at is the overall strategic, also security relationship that exists. Because in the past there's always been this sort of assumption that the United States is there for the protection of the Gulf states and the Arab Gulf monarchies in exchange for a stable supply of oil coming out of the region. Now, if the West continues on its trajectory in terms of producing shale oil and unconventional methods of gas and oil production, that will decrease its dependency on the Middle East necessarily, that will open up and change the whole strategic environment in the end of the case. Already we have this debate in the region itself, in the Gulf, about US more pivoting to Asia strategically, withdrawing with its military forces from the region slowly. Because, as a matter of fact, also the US has not had the best experiences in the last couple of decades in the Middle East. Really expensive military engagements in Afghanistan and Iraq. And now we are looking at the US opening its doors to Iran over the nuclear negotiations. Possibly this will close a door there on one of the most contentious relationships in recent times. And the US lessening overall its need to be there strategically over time if it doesn't require the oil from the region.
Okay, slightly away from the Middle East, just for this question. Can shale oil and gas really provide a sort of cheaper long-term alternative for governments? Because we've seen failures like the one in Poland, where Poland was supposed to act as a sort of beacon for fracking or shale, exploiting shale in Europe. We saw American companies come over and they failed. I mean, that could have been to do with the sort of geology. I think that was what was the problem there. But could we see it becoming a viable alternative, cheaper?
Well, I think we're still far off at the moment to have that kind of scenario where we really can talk about shale oil being the alternative to the present hydrocarbon resources that are available. Certainly it gives the US a little bit more of a leeway. We have to remember that shale oil is not necessarily cheap oil. It is expensive still to produce. Yes, prices have come down a little bit, but overall, the whole environment in the oil market right now is benefiting from shale oil because it also keeps prices relatively high. You need a price of approximately $80 a barrel of oil in order to be able to keep on having the investment into shale oil to make it something financially possibly. And therefore, even the oil producers are benefiting from a relatively high price of oil at the moment that supports their own budgetary requirements. So we are looking at something that is generally beneficial for all sides at the moment, but I don't think it necessarily will clear the United States or the West as a whole from many of its commitments still in the Middle East. Despite the fact that Asia is getting most of the Middle East oil, the US is still the primary security benefactor in the region, and there's no replacement for the US on that front in the near term to be seen.
With the US in mind, do you think then, and finally, Christian, do you think the long-term goal, this new way of tapping into oil and gas, do you think this is basically the US, especially when we're looking at the US's desire really to become a sort of energy hub, to not rely so much on the Middle East, and to see Europe, which is closely allied to the US, not have to rely on big countries like developing countries like Russia, and almost like the US become its own sort of hub where it can export energy to countries, perhaps one day even the Middle East. Do you think that? I mean, you mentioned earlier it was a long way off, but realistically, things can change quite quickly. Do you think this is essentially the sort of policy at the moment?
Well, I think there's definitely an interest in the US in continuing to put money into the development of shale oil because it does offer that opportunity to become less dependent on the region. But we also have to remember the US is not the only one who is starting to make these investments. China is investing heavily into shale oil as well. Even Saudi Arabia has recently announced making investments into that region. So down the road, we might see a scenario, yes, shale oil starts to becoming more and more important, but because many other countries are also getting involved in it, that means to overall energy production. And it doesn't just mean that the US crystallizes itself out as being the main hub for shale oil in the near future, is everybody will start benefiting, which then could drive energy prices down a little bit, if this would really to happen on a large scale in the next 10 to 20 years.
Dr. Christian Koch, thank you very much for coming into the studio today.
It was my pleasure.
That's it from Dukascopy TV for the moment. Of course, we'll be bringing you more updates and exclusive interviews as the day wears on. But for now, from me, bye-bye.